In the spring of 1987, a county appraiser named Gerald Hopp drove out to the Westerfield property on the east edge of Crittenden County, Arkansas, stood at the fence line of what used to be 83 acres of bottomland marsh, and wrote 2 words in his field notebook: waste ground. The land had been drained in the 1950s by a drainage district that wanted to squeeze a few more rows of cotton out of the river flat. It never produced reliable cotton. The ground was too wet in March, too cracked in August. And every few years the river found its old channels anyway, and made the whole argument irrelevant. By 1987 it was overgrown with willow scrub and black gum, the ditches half-silted, and a woman named Vera Nall had just paid $160 an acre for all of it. Gerald Hopp told the men at the Farm Bureau coffee that morning that he hadn't seen a sorrier piece of ground change hands in 20 years of appraising. What Vera paid in the spring of 1987 was $13,280 for 83 acres of land the county itself had written off. What Ducks Unlimited paid her, 16 years later, was $412,000 for a conservation easement on the same ground that by then had become one of the most productive restored bottomland marshes in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, pulling migratory waterfowl by the tens of thousands every winter, cataloged by wildlife biologists who drove down from Memphis just to count what had come back. That is a gap of 16 years and $398,720. This is the story of what happened in between and of why Gerald Hopp, who was not a bad man and not a dishonest one, got it exactly wrong. Vera Nall was 51 years old in 1987 and was known in Crittenden County for 2 things. She was known for being quiet in a way that made people underestimate her steadily and consistently, and she was known for remembering what the land used to be. She had grown up in a farmhouse 2 miles from the Westerfield tract. Her father, Harold Nall, ran cattle on the ridge ground and had told her, from the time she was old enough to follow him, on his evening walk, that the bottomland below the bluff had once been something close to miraculous. He had been a boy in the 1930s, and he remembered the flights. He remembered the sound of mallards coming off a flooded field before dawn, a sound he described as thunder that moved. He remembered his own father pointing at the marsh in late October and telling him that what was sitting on that water was worth more than any cash crop the same acreage could grow, if a man was patient enough to think about it correctly. Harold Nall never owned the Westerfield ground. He watched it get drained and watched it fail to produce cotton, and said nothing, because it was not his land to argue about. Vera inherited the memory the way she inherited her father's watch. She carried it without displaying it. Harold had kept a record of his own, not of water levels or duck counts, but of what the land had once produced without any cultivation. He had a lined composition book, soft-covered, and in it he had written down species names he had looked up in the library in Marion, and the Latin names beside them in his careful printing, and dates of observation, and rough estimates of numbers. He was not a naturalist, and he did not claim to be. He was a cattle farmer who had noticed something. He had noticed that the drainage project of the 1950s had not simply converted wetland to cropland. It had removed something from the landscape that had no replacement in any agricultural column. He wrote that down, too, in his plain way, at the bottom of the last page of entries. In 1959, the year after the ditches went in and the water left, he wrote, "This ground was worth more than they knew how to count." Vera had read that line when she was 12 years old, and sitting at his desk while he was out checking cattle. She had not understood it the way she understood it later. But she did not forget it either. When Harold died in 1979, the composition book came to her with the watch and the field glasses and $400 in a cedar box. She put the book on the shelf and the field glasses on the hook by the back door, and she used both of them for the next 8 years before she ever needed them in the way he had intended. She worked as a bookkeeper for a farm supply cooperative in Marion for 18 years. She lived carefully. When the Westerfield estate finally settled in the spring of 1987, and the heirs who had moved to St. Louis and to Tulsa and to Dallas decided that a quick sale at $160 an acre was easier than managing a piece of ground none of them had visited in a decade, Vera was ready. She had been watching the listing. She used her savings. She paid cash. Word of the sale moved through the county the way such things do. By the following Thursday, when Gerald Hopp mentioned it over coffee at the Farm Bureau office in Marion, 3 other men were already aware of it. One of them was a crop insurance agent named Ron Shipley, who had once tried to help the previous owners get a disaster payment on the failed cotton and knew the ground was beyond reclaiming. Another was a retired extension agent named Bill Oakes, who had spent 30 years advising farmers in the county and who described what Vera had done, not unkindly, as sentiment dressed up as investment. She grew up near that ground, Bill Oakes said. You know how it is. People get attached to what they remember. That doesn't make a drained marsh into farmland. Gerald Hopp agreed. He said he had put $160 an acre on the appraisal form, and he thought that was generous. He said the property had no productive capacity, that the drainage infrastructure was gone, and that the woman who bought it was going to find that out when she tried to do anything with it. Ron Shipley said the most charitable reading was that she had bought herself a place to walk in the evening. He did not mean it as a compliment. Gerald Hopp was not a bad man. He was accurate about what he could measure, and he did not inflate his assessments for flattery or reduce them for spite. He had appraised 500 properties in Crittenden County, and he had been right about nearly all of them. He had simply never been asked to measure a seed bank or a flyway or 30 years of interrupted hydrology pressing against a silted ditch. Those things were not on his form. Gerald Hopp was not the only one who laughed. Her brother-in-law, Dale Strickler, who farmed 600 acres of row crops in the county and was considered a practical man, drove out with her the week after closing and stood at the edge of the silted ditch and said, "Vera, this is just a mess." He said it with genuine concern, not cruelty. He meant that the ground was unworkable, that the drainage infrastructure was destroyed, and that she had spent her savings on something with no apparent path to return. Dale's own operation was leveraged into a new planter and a grain bin, and he understood investment through the language of yield per acre and input cost. By that standard, what Vera had bought had no column on the ledger that showed a number. She told him she wasn't planning to drain it. He drove home thinking she had made a mistake she would spend a long time paying for. Let me tell you about what a bottomland hardwood marsh is and what it does, because without understanding the mechanism, the rest of this story is just luck. And it was not luck. The lower Mississippi alluvial valley was once the largest contiguous bottomland hardwood wetland system in North America. Before the drainage projects of the mid-20th century, the river's floodplain from Missouri to Louisiana carried a mosaic of cypress swamps, willow thickets, seasonally flooded bottomland timber, and open marsh that absorbed floodwater, filtered runoff, built soil, and provided wintering habitat for migratory waterfowl along the Mississippi Flyway in quantities that contemporary biologists can only estimate. Mallards, pintails, gadwalls, teals, canvasbacks, and dozens of other species staged along that corridor every autumn, fueling themselves on the seeds of native moist soil plants before moving on or settling in for the winter. The drainage projects changed that. By the 1980s, more than 80% of the original bottomland wetland in the valley had been converted, most of it to soybean and cotton production. The flyway still existed as a geographic corridor. The birds still came. But the habitat they needed had largely been replaced by bare ground that drained as fast as the ditch tile could carry the water away. Many of the birds that had historically concentrated in the valley were moving through faster, stopping less, losing condition. The biologists who studied the flyway had been documenting the decline in wintering waterfowl numbers for 15 years by the time Vera bought her 83 acres. What Vera understood, because Harold Nall had told her, and because she had read everything the local wildlife agent had ever left at the cooperative's counter, was that bottomland wetland does not need to be managed into existence. It needs to be allowed back. The hydrology that made the Westerfield tract a marsh was not gone. The drainage district had interrupted it. The silted ditches were evidence of a system trying to return to its own equilibrium. Given time and a little help, the ground would reassemble itself. The help she gave it was modest and specific. In the fall of 1987, she hired a dozer operator named Tommy Birch to plug the main drainage ditch with a low earthen dam at the south end of the property. One plug. It cost her $900. The following spring, water sat on 61 of the 83 acres from February through late April. In the shallow margins, moist soil plants began to establish from the seed bank, already in the ground, smartweed and barnyard grass and wild millet, coming up without any planting. Vera did not plant them. They had been waiting in the soil for 30 years, dormant, ready. She stacked no brochures. She told no one what she was doing. She went out on Sunday mornings in October with her father's old binoculars and wrote down what she saw. The first winter, there were geese, mostly Canada geese moving through, a few dozen mallards. The second winter, there were more. By the fall of 1990, 3 years after the single ditch plug, she was counting mallards in the hundreds on the open water before dawn. She wrote the numbers in a spiral notebook she kept on the shelf above the kitchen table. Dale Strickler drove past the property in November of 1991 and stopped at the road. He rolled down the window of his truck and sat there for a long time, watching ducks work the flooded timber. He did not stop at Vera's house. He was not ready to say anything about it yet. The watching community in Crittenden County at this point was not large, but it included a wildlife agent named Lewis Carr, who had been stationed in the county since 1984, and who had been documenting the slow, ongoing loss of wetland habitat in the district for his whole career there. Lewis had driven past the Westerfield property 200 times and seen nothing but scrub. In the winter of 1991, he stopped to look at what Vera had on the water and counted from the road with his own binoculars, and then drove to the cooperative and waited until she was at her desk. He asked her what she had done to get that many birds on that piece of ground. She told him about the ditch plug. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if she had considered a second plug on the lateral ditch at the north end. She said she had been thinking about it. He said he could help her apply for a federal cost-share program that would pay for water control structures. He said the structures would let her manage the water levels seasonally, flooding the marsh in October and drawing it down gradually through spring so the moist soil plants could set seed and establish a stable food base. If the money you have been setting aside will stretch to a partnership on this, he said, it might be worth doing. She said it would stretch. What Vera built between 1992 and 1994 with federal cost-share money covering half the materials and Lewis Carr's knowledge covering the planning, was a simple water management system on 83 acres of restored bottomland. 2 water control structures, slotted riser pipe, and stop-log assemblies set in earthen berms, the kind of engineering that has been used on wetland impoundments since the 1940s. A stop-log is a wooden plank, typically 2 inches thick and as wide as the structure, that you add or remove to raise or lower the water level. A slotted riser pipe controls the drain rate. The whole system cost $4,200 out of pocket after the cost share, and it gave Vera the ability to mimic what the river had historically done, flooding in autumn, holding through winter, beginning to draw down in late spring to let the seed plants grow. The mechanism of a managed moist soil unit, as Lewis explained it to her and as she recorded it in the notebook she had started keeping more carefully, is that early successional plants, the smart weeds and wild millets and sedges that establish in shallow, disturbed soil, are almost perfectly calibrated as waterfowl food. Their seeds are small, abundant, high in carbohydrates, and they grow in exactly the shallow flooded conditions that dabbling ducks, the tipping-up ducks, the mallards and teals and pinetails are designed to harvest. The birds work the water in 2 to 4 inches of depth, upending to reach the bottom, and an acre of good moist soil impoundment can produce enough seed to carry several hundred duck days of nutrition through a winter. Vera's 83 acres, once the management system was running properly, would put food on the water in concentrations that the stripped bottomland around her could not approach. The mechanism of a managed moist soil unit also explained why the county's appraiser could not measure what Vera was growing. A yield map measures what you plant and what you harvest, and what the market will pay for it on a specific date. It does not have a column for standing seed that a mallard consumes while swimming in 2 inches of water in November. It does not track the food energy that a pintail carries south across the Gulf of Mexico, or the soil stability that a wetland's root structure provides to the land around it, or the water that a 61-acre impoundment holds back from a field drain during a high-water event. These are real outputs. They appear on no ledger Gerald Hopp was ever asked to consult. What Vera was producing, beginning in 1993 when the water control system was fully operational, was measured not in bushels per acre, but in duck days of habitat, a unit biologists use to estimate carrying capacity. 1 duck day equals 1 waterfowl using 1 acre of wetland for 1 day. A well-managed moist soil impoundment in the alluvial valley can produce enough seed and invertebrate biomass in the drawdown months to support several hundred duck days per acre across a winter. Vera's 83 acres, at that rate, was putting food on the water for tens of thousands of individual bird uses across the season. The hunting club from Memphis was paying for access to that resource. The Ducks Unlimited organization would later pay for its permanent protection. But the resource itself had been accumulating for 6 years before either of those transactions was possible. She did not manage the system for maximum bird numbers. She managed it for stability. She learned to read the water level from the color of the emergent vegetation at the margins, from the mud lines on the control-structured boards, from what Lewis told her and what the notebook told her when she went back to the entries from 3 years prior. She made small adjustments. She paid attention. That was the entire input. Gerald Hopp, who was still appraising property in Crittenden County, drove past the Westerfield tract in November of 1993 and saw the birds on the water and pulled his truck to the shoulder for a full 3 minutes. He counted as well as he could from the road. He saw mallards in numbers he associated with the public wildlife management areas downriver, not with a private tract that had been silted scrub 6 years ago. He did not stop. He drove to the Farm Bureau and told the men at the coffee table that something unusual was happening out there. Ron Shipley asked what he meant by unusual. Gerald Hopp said he meant there were ducks on the Westerfield property. A lot of ducks. He said he couldn't explain it. Bill Oakes, who had retired from the Extension Service the previous spring, said the woman had gotten lucky with the water table. He said it happened sometimes with low ground. He said it was an anomaly. Gerald Hopp wrote that word in his field notebook later that afternoon. Anomaly. He wrote it next to the property address and the dollar figure he had appraised it for 6 years prior. He did not cross out the figure. He simply wrote the word beside it, as if that settled something. He believed it did. Dale Strickler, Vera's brother-in-law, had a different kind of year in 1993. He had borrowed heavily to add 240 acres of row crop ground in 1991 at land prices that looked reasonable in the spring and looked less so by fall when commodity prices compressed. His input costs that year were running $37 an acre for chemicals alone, and a wet spring had pushed his planting dates back and cut into his yield on the soybean ground. His banker was asking questions. He was managing a real operation with real margins, and he knew every number it contained, but the numbers were not comfortable. Vera's $812 in annual property tax was the entirety of her cost on the 83 acres in 1993. She had no crop input. She had no equipment payment. The cost share program had been paid back in full by the federal allocation and her own contribution 4 years prior. The land was carrying itself. She had also, by 1993, been contacted by a duck hunting club from Memphis. The contact came through Lewis Carr, who had mentioned the property in passing to a state wildlife officer, who had mentioned it to a hunting guide he knew, and the word had eventually reached a group of 4 men, 3 attorneys, and a dentist, who had been hunting the public wetland management areas in Crittenden County for several years, and understood what they were looking at when they heard the description of what Vera had on her water. They drove down in 2 vehicles on a Thursday in September and knocked on her door. They were polite and businesslike. The lead man was an attorney from East Memphis named Henderson, who wore clean duck hunting gear and explained what they were looking for and asked what she would take for a lease on the season. She told them the property was $812 in annual taxes, and she would want to come out ahead of that. Henderson looked at his watch for a moment, which was not a dismissal, only a habit. He said he thought $3,000 for the season was fair for 83 acres. She said she thought $4,000 was fair. Henderson looked at the 2 men beside him. He said that worked. They signed a single-page agreement at her kitchen table using her pen. She told Lewis that evening. He laughed and said, "That was when you knew the birds were really there." The hunting club came back every year through the decade. The lease rate climbed, $4,500 in 1995, $5,000 in 1997, $6,200 by 1999. Vera deposited the checks and made no changes to the management system. The money was not the point. The return on $160 an acre, even before the lease income, was already something the county appraiser's framework had no category to record. If you have ever watched a wetland work, you might understand something of what she was watching from the levee road those October mornings. There is a particular quality to the light on flooded timber just before sunrise when the birds are coming in. They do not announce themselves the way Canada geese do. They come in fast and low, the wings set, and they hit the water in the dark in a sound that is both violent and quiet at the same time. Her father had called it thunder that moved. She understood now what he meant. The following decade brought two things into sharp focus. One was the statewide and national attention beginning to fall on the restored wetland corridor along the Mississippi Flyway as conservation organizations and state wildlife agencies tallied what had survived and what could be recovered. The other was the drought of 1999 to 2001, which hammered row crop operations in the Mid-South with two consecutive short years followed by a partial year recovery that left many operators with elevated debt and compressed margins. Dale Strickler sold his 240 acres of added ground in 2001 at a 9% loss relative to what he had paid. He took the hit, cleared the debt, and went back to his original 600. He was not ruined. He was a practical man, and he made a practical correction. But the correction cost him. Vera's Marsh produced reliable water through the drought years because she had learned to manage the drawdown cycle conservatively, leaving enough in the impoundment to carry through dry falls. The hunting club's lease did not waver. In 2000, a year when the county agricultural bulletin listed average cash rent on cropland at $81 an acre, Vera was netting $75 an acre in hunting lease revenue from her unfarmable ground, and that figure did not include the appreciation in the land value itself, which nobody was yet measuring correctly because no category existed for it. What changed the calculation was Ducks Unlimited. Let me tell you about Ducks Unlimited and conservation easements, because the mechanism here is specific, and the number at the end of it does not make sense without the explanation. Ducks Unlimited is a non-profit conservation organization founded in 1937 to restore and protect wetland habitat in the Mississippi Flyway and across North America. It operates through a combination of private fundraising, federal partnership programs, and landowner agreements. One of its primary tools is the conservation easement. A conservation easement is a legal agreement between a landowner and a conservation entity in which the landowner voluntarily restricts future development and drainage of their land in exchange for a payment. The payment is calculated based on the difference between the appraised value of the land as it could be developed and the appraised value of the land under the restrictions of the easement. The landowner retains ownership. They retain the right to lease the land for hunting. They retain the right to manage the habitat within the terms of the agreement. They give up only the right to drain, fill, or develop the property. By 2002, Ducks Unlimited's Arkansas program was actively seeking easement agreements with landowners who held restored or restorable wetland in the alluvial valley. The organization had been working in the state since the 1980s, when the cumulative loss of bottomland habitat along the Mississippi Flyway had begun to register in ways that the annual waterfowl breeding population surveys could no longer soften. The surveys tracked breeding pairs in the prairie pothole region of the northern Great Plains, where most of North America's dabbling ducks were produced. What the winter's surveys tracked was how those birds moved through the continent's wetland corridors on their way to and from the Gulf states. The lower Mississippi Valley had once been the corridor's most productive wintering ground. What remained of it, in 2002, was roughly 18% of what had existed before the drainage era. The organization's easement program was designed to hold what was left and, where possible, lock in restored parcels like Vera's before their legal status could change with a future sale or inheritance. The organization had staff biologists who identified candidate properties using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and records from the Federal Wetland Restoration cost-share programs. The Westerfield Tract, Vera's 83 acres, appeared on their candidate list, because of the cost-share records Lewis Carr had filed in 1992. A DU field biologist named Marsh Elgin called Vera's telephone in January of 2002. Marcia drove down from the organization's state office in Little Rock. She put on rubber boots and walked the property with Vera on a bright, cold morning in February. The impoundment holding 3 feet of water in the central basin and mallards scattered in the flooded timber at the north end. Marcia had been evaluating wetland properties in the alluvial valley for 6 years. She walked the levee road from the south water control structure to the north berm and back, pausing to examine the stop log assembly, to note the fringe vegetation at the shallow margin, to look at the drawdown scar on the earthen bank that told her how the water had moved through the previous season. She stopped at the west edge of the south basin, where the cattail fringe met the open water, and stood there for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Vera stood behind her and did not fill the silence. Marcia asked how long the management system had been running. Vera said since 1993, 11 years of consistent water cycling. Marcia turned around. "That's the part that matters," she said. She said anyone could plug a ditch. The 11 years of patient management had allowed the seed bank to stabilize and the vegetation communities to sort themselves into productive sequences. The shallow basin at the south end had developed a cattail fringe that buffered wind and provided thermal cover in cold weather, which was why, she said, the teal concentrated there early in the season before the main migration came through. The open water zone carried submerged aquatic vegetation in the drawdown months. The moist soil flats at the margins were producing smartweed in volumes she could estimate by the plant density and by where the mallards were working, because mallards do not distribute randomly across a wetland. They are feeding, and they concentrate where the feeding is good. And 11 years of managed drawdown cycles had made the margins of Vera's impoundment the best smartweed ground in the county. She asked Vera if she had records. Vera told her about the notebook. Marcia asked if she could see it. Vera said it was in the truck. They walked back, and Vera handed it through the window, and Marcia stood in the cold February light and paged through entries from 1987 to the current winter, the water level notations and the species counts and the drawdown dates. She was quiet for some time. She handed it back and said the property would qualify for an easement and that the valuation would be based on a certified appraisal comparing the as-improved development value against the restricted value. Vera said she would think about it. She called Lewis Carr that evening. He said it was the right program for the right piece of ground. He said the payment would be significant. He said she should get a copy of the appraisal before she signed anything. The appraisal came back in the fall of 2002. The certified appraiser hired by Ducks Unlimited was a man named Carl Whitmer, who operated out of Pine Bluff and had done easement valuations on 14 properties in the alluvial valley over the previous 5 years. He spent most of one day on the Westerfield tract, walking the berms and taking notes and photographing the vegetation communities and the water control infrastructure. He noted in his report that the restoration condition of the property was exceptional relative to other easement candidates he had evaluated in the county, citing the vegetation species mix, the establishment of the cattail thermal cover fringe, and what he described as documented multi-year management consistency, for which he had reviewed Vera's spiral notebook at her invitation. He appraised the Westerfield tract at $5,010 an acre as unrestricted rural land with development potential, based on comparable sales of similar bottomland ground in the county that had been drained and put into row crop production. The easement restricted value was $812 an acre. The difference was $4,198 per acre. Vera sat at the kitchen table with the appraisal document in front of her, and Harold's composition book open beside it, the last page visible, the line Harold had written in 1959, looking up at her from the bottom of the page. This ground was worth more than they knew how to count. She set the composition book aside. She did the arithmetic on the back of an envelope. 83 acres. $4,198 per acre. She checked the multiplication twice. The Ducks' unlimited easement payment, when it was finalized in the spring of 2003, was $412,344. For 83 acres she had bought for $13,280 16 years before. She read the final figure to Lewis Carr over the telephone the day the paperwork was complete. She read it in the same flat, precise register she had used at the cooperative's desk for 18 years, reading numbers aloud from a ledger, and she heard him breathe in. There was a long pause on the line. He said, "Vera." Just the name. Nothing else. The silence held for several more seconds, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. She told him she wanted him to come out the following Saturday. She wanted to show him what the notebook said the South impoundment was producing in late winter seed density, and she thought they needed to talk about whether a shallow scrape in the northwest corner would extend the productive habitat zone into the upland margin. She was not done. That was what the silence meant. The DU payment was not a windfall she spent. She paid off the remaining $4,200 she had borrowed from her savings account when she installed the water control structures. She paid 3 years' worth of county taxes in advance. She transferred $6,000 to the Youth Wildlife Education Program at the County Extension Office, enough to fund a wetland unit for the district's middle school science classes for a decade. She kept the hunting lease, which was now bringing $7,500 a year from the Memphis Club, and she negotiated with DU's local program staff to continue the moist soil management program as a demonstration site available to the State Wildlife Agency for annual bird surveys. Gerald Hopp retired from appraising in 2004. His successor, a younger man from Jonesboro named Paul Garrett, drove the Westerfield tract in his first month on the job because it had been flagged in the county database as an unusual easement sale. He called the DU state office to understand the valuation methodology. He filed a note in the county records describing the property as a Tier 1 restored wetland unit with documented conservation value well above comparable agricultural ground. He did not call it waste ground. Dale Strickler was doing better by 2004, the row crop margins having stabilized and his operation running clean on the 600 acres he had held through the correction. He stopped at Vera's house in the fall of that year, which he had not done since the week after her closing in 1987. She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spiral notebook she had left open there, and at the single page from the appraisal she kept folded inside the cover, which was not there to show anyone in particular. It was just there. He looked at it for a while. "I told you it was a mess," he said. "It was," she said. "You didn't fix it." "No," she said. "I let it fix itself." He asked her what the notebook was. She explained the water level records, the vegetation observations, the duck counts by species. He turned pages. He had not known she had been recording these things for 16 years. He asked how she had known what to record. She said her father had told her to pay attention to what used to be there, and Lewis Carr had taught her the rest. Dale left that afternoon and drove home thinking about the 240 acres he had sold in 2001. The ground had been river-bottom land. Some of it had been wetland before the drainage project of the 1950s. He had bought it as row crop and sold it as row crop. He wondered for the first time what had been in the soil there before the tile went in. He did not say any of this to anyone. He just drove home and thought about it. In the years after the easement closed, neighbors and county conservation staff began stopping at the Westerfield property in the fall, not to ask permission, but to ask questions. A family named Crowell that held 41 acres of similar drained bottomland 2 miles south asked Vera if she would walk their ground with them. She did one Saturday in March and told them what she saw in the drainage infrastructure and what she thought was sitting in the seed bank under the grass. She recommended they call Lewis Carr and apply for the same cost-share program she had used in 1992. The Crowells plugged their main ditch in the fall of that year. Within 3 winters, they had waterfowl on the water in numbers that surprised them. Vera went back the second year and walked the property with the Crowell daughter, a young woman named Beth, who had come back from the University of Arkansas with a degree in environmental science and had not yet found a way to apply it on the family farm. Vera brought the spiral notebook, the one she had started in 1987, and showed Beth the early entries and the later ones and explained what she was looking at in the difference between them. She showed her how to read the vegetation at the margin and what the mud line on the stop log board was telling you about the water level trend. Beth asked if she could see the DU easement documents. Vera said yes and walked her through the appraisal methodology so she understood the mechanism that had generated the payment. Beth understood the financial logic in 30 minutes. She began calling the DU state office that spring to ask about easement programs on the Crowell ground. This is what transmission looks like. Not a speech, not a grand gesture, a notebook taken off a shelf, an afternoon on a levee road, a young woman with a degree that suddenly had a place to go. What Vera knew in 1987 was not sophisticated. It was not a model built from data. It was a single inherited sentence, passed from grandfather to father to daughter, that the bottomland below the bluff had once been something close to miraculous, and it was in the nature of such things to want to be miraculous again. Gerald Hopp was right about what the ground looked like. He was wrong about what it was. He could not see the seed bank in the soil or the flyway overhead or the 30 years of hydrology that a ditch plug would let resume. He was measuring what was easy to count, which was the silted scrub and the failed cotton rows, and he called that the truth of the land. The ground itself settled the argument, the way bottomland always does. It took 16 years and no dramatic intervention. It took attention and patience, and one woman who had been taught by her father to remember what a piece of the world used to be. A system that values only what it can cultivate at scale will always misread land that produces its wealth in a different register. The flyway does not appear on a yield map. The seed bank does not show up in a soil test until it is already growing. The wintering mallard tells you nothing a spreadsheet can interrogate. These things are real, but their measure requires a kind of knowing that the county appraiser's notebook was not designed to hold to. What is rigid breaks. What pays attention survives. The Westerfield tract carries water every winter now, managed by Beth Crowell under a stewardship agreement with the DU state program, Vera having transferred the management responsibilities in 2011 when her knees made the levee walks difficult. Vera still goes out in October. She sits in the truck with the window down and listens. The spiral notebook is on the shelf above Beth's kitchen table now. 17 years of water level records and duck counts written in Vera's careful bookkeeper's hand, with Beth's own entries beginning in a slightly different script on the pages that follow. The notebook is not a museum piece. It is a working document. Beth adds to it every fall. The land does not know what the county paid for it. It knows the water and the seed and the birds that come down out of the cold sky in October and the woman who remembered to let it be what it wanted to be. That is all it ever needed.